In the days after the September 11th terror attacks, the FBI, which had failed to prevent them, participated in the roundup of 750 Muslim immigrant men. As the war on terror was launched not just abroad but at home, the FBI escalated its surveillance of Muslim American, Arab American, and South Asian American communities, showing that when it came to countering terrorism, the FBI viewed race, religion, and national origin as grounds for suspicion. This is the Still Spying podcast presented by Defending Rights and Dissent, and I am host, Chip Gibbons. Later in this episode, I have the immense honor of being joined by Abdeen Jabara. Abdeen was a civil rights attorney for decades. As a past president of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee and a former board member for the Center for Constitutional Rights, Abdeen was involved in fighting against the types of abuses we talk about on this program. And he didn't just defend others against FBI surveillance, he himself was spied on by the FBI. As part of his lawsuit against the FBI, it was revealed that the NSA had spied on him as well. Abdeen was in fact the first U.S. citizen publicly identified to have been subjected to NSA surveillance. This was in the 1970s, by the way, not in the post-9/11 War on Terror era. But first, let's take a look at the wider picture of the FBI's attacks on Muslim Americans and Arab American communities. Shortly before setting out to record this, the Supreme Court reached a unanimous decision in Tanzin v. Tanvir, ruling that 4 Muslim men could sue individual FBI agents for monetary damages under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. The agents in question used the no-fly list to try to coerce the men into becoming informants and spying on their communities. The use of informants has been key to the FBI's surveilling of the Muslim community. This includes placing informants in mosques and other community spaces where the FBI had no reason to suspect any criminal activity was taking place. Operation Flex is a particularly egregious case of FBI infiltration of the Muslim community, and it embodies the suspicionless nature of this surveillance. Craig Monteisle, an FBI informant, was paid to infiltrate Southern California mosque and gather personal information such as email addresses, cell phone numbers, and political and religious views. He was even encouraged to enter into sexual relations with Muslim women in order to gather intelligence. Who was the target of his surveillance? According to Monteisle, the FBI had identified no targets and said the targets would come to the informant. In short, it was broad, dragnet surveillance of Muslim Americans. Ironically, the informant's cover was blown when a mosque he was infiltrating reported him to the FBI due to his erratic behavior and extremist statement. These FBI informants often act as agent provocateurs, concocting non-existing terror plots and enticing people, oftentimes extremely vulnerable people, and sometimes with the offer of financial reward, to engage in them, only for the FBI to swoop in, arrest them, and declare they've thwarted terrorism. One of Donald Trump's Muslim ban executive orders actually cites 2 non-existent plots concocted by FBI agent provocateurs as justification for his Muslim ban. While this targeting is part of the post-9/11 war on terror at home, it is also part of a much larger history of abuse. On our first episode, we discussed with former FBI agent Mike German about Operation Vulgar Betrayal, a 1990s sprawling investigation targeting American Muslims. And we know, during the run-up to the first Gulf War, the FBI knocked on the doors of Arab Americans to interview them about their political views. Beginning in the 1980s and continuing well into the 2000s, the FBI initiated deportation proceedings against 7 Palestinian immigrants and 1 Kenyan immigrant, known as the Los Angeles 8, for activity in support of Palestinian rights the FBI conceded was entirely protected by the First Amendment. From 1979 to 1989, the FBI conducted a 10-year intelligence investigation into the General Union of Palestinian Students. This investigation was finally terminated in 1989 due to the fact that no evidence existed suggesting links between the group and international terrorism. That's after 1 decade of spying that during the investigation, the FBI sought to track the formation of new chapters, establish the identities and whereabouts of the student group's leaders. And Richard Nixon, in 1972, initiated a sprawling investigation into both Arab immigrants to the U.S. and Arab Americans called Operation Boulder. Under Operation Boulder, 150,000 people were spied on. Under the guise of combating terrorism, the FBI has for decades spied on Muslim Americans and Arab Americans and sought to undermine domestic political advocacy that departed from the official U.S. line on foreign policy. To talk about this more, we're joined by Abdeen Jabara. Abdeen is a longtime civil rights attorney based in New York City. He is a past president of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee and served on the board of directors for the Center for Constitutional Rights for 20 years. Abdeen, thank you so much for joining us on the Still Spying podcast today.
Wonderful to be with you.
So just to start off, something that was in the news recently was that the Supreme Court, in a case brought by the Center for Constitutional Rights, ruled that 4 Muslim American men who were placed on the no-fly list can seek monetary damages against the individual FBI agents who had used the no-fly list to coerce them into spying on their communities. As someone who has been a civil rights attorney for decades and has challenged surveillance and discrimination, what's your reaction to this news?
Well, of course, it's great news, but there's also it's kind of bittersweet in the sense that these regulations, no-fly regulations, have been in place in 3 different presidencies. They started when President Bush was in office, and they went through the two Obama administrations, and now through the Trump administration. And for people to challenge them without resources like the Center for Constitutional Rights, for instance, is impossible. So yes, it's a great thing, and I'm happy about this. But it also has that downside. The second thing is that this is just the beginning of this case, because they can claim qualified immunity, the FBI agents, and they can claim that they didn't know it was illegal at the time they did it. And if the court finds that they had qualified immunity, that would, of course, protect them. So, they're just halfway there or a quarter of the way there. But it still is important because it was a unanimous decision in the Supreme Court, and it helps to set perhaps a rollback for all the anti-Muslim measures that have been taken since the beginning of the Trump presidency.
Yeah, and, the Supreme Court obviously ruled, as it usually does, on a very sort of narrow technical issue. But as you hinted at, there's much larger issues at stake here, including the no-fly list, but also this sort of the use of infiltrators and informants. The FBI has basically subjected the Muslim American, Arab American, and South Asian American communities to suspicionless surveillance, basically treating them by virtue of their national origin, religion, or ethnicity as being a 5th column. What's the impact of that type of surveillance on a community?
There are 2 demarcations about surveillance. Prior to the attack on the World Trade Center, it was the Arabs that were the target of the surveillance. Now, following the 9/11, it became a much larger net that was cast targeting all Muslims, and the fear that has been created by this is very palpable, particularly here in the tri-state area of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania and Connecticut. Actually, that's 4 states where they had a huge program that the New York Police Department engaged in cooperation with the Joint Terrorism Task Force to map all of the concentrations of Muslims and infiltrate the mosques and develop informers and getting, people who were charged with crimes to agree to become informants, etc. So it had a I guess what they call a chilling effect is the legal term on these people's lives. They, began to suspect people in their mosques, and it created a bad situation. I can understand that after 9/11, certain measures would have to be taken to protect the United States. But I think there was a gross overreaction. Now, if we recall the Handshoe case, which judge here in New York, who's still a sitting judge, went and modified after 9/11 to allow police to engage in surveillance where there was no criminal predicate. They had no suspicion of any crime being conducted, but were allowed to conduct surveillance to unearth anything that might be untoward in terms of the law. And the whole rationale for this has been that this is terrorism. This is international terrorism and not domestic criminal activity. So it's had a very heavy effect. It cut down a great deal on people attending mosques and going to community events, etc.
For people listening at home, I just want to note that we did a deep dive into the Handshoe agreement and Handshoe case on our episode, The FBI versus the Young Lords. So if people want to learn more about it, I would suggest listening to that episode. I was struck by something you said when you mentioned that pre-9/11, the target of the surveillance was Arabs, and post-9/11, it was Muslim Americans. A couple of other people who have done this sort of work for a long time, and remember working and organizing against the FBI visits to Arab Americans during the first Gulf War, and then of course all of the post 9/11 abuses have made that similar observation to me. I'm wondering what you think caused that shift, and I'm also wondering, how does the FBI's behavior post 9/11 with surveilling the Muslim American community fit into their larger history with that community?
Well, here's one thing that people have to understand. Number one, how closely tied the United States is to intelligence gathering that would be supportive of Israel. This began basically at the time of the June 1967 war. At that time, there was a U.S. intelligence ship called the SS Liberty that was in the Mediterranean, and it was hit by Israeli missiles, and 34 American sailors and personnel were killed in that. And it was pretty much covered up by the Johnson administration. The Johnson administration had given Israel a green light for that war because they didn't think that the Soviet Union would get involved. And ever since that time, any resistance to the occupation was regarded as terrorist activity. And that filtered down into the American intelligence community, and that anybody who was supportive of the Palestinians in their struggle were potentially targeted for surveillance. And that's where I came in, and I brought my lawsuit in 1972.
Yeah, let's talk about that. That's the next thing I wanted to ask you about. How did you first come to suspect the FBI was spying on you?
Well, there were two things. Number one, I had them visit me in my home in an attempt to interview me. And secondly, as I read in Newsweek magazine, in something called the Periscope section, the wiretaps had been initiated on 22 Palestinians in the United States. And I was certain that some of those were clients of mine or who had called me for one reason or another. And therefore, I thought there would have been some overhears. And that's when I brought my lawsuit. And fortunately, after I brought it and they responded to my in pro per complaint, the ACLU became interested in the case and agreed to represent me for the rest of the time in that case. And we discovered a great deal of information in it. I mean, a lot of it was surveillance of speeches that I gave at different events and so forth. But it also included asking the NSA for any communications I had outside the United States. And the NSA did provide them with 6 communications. I have no idea what they were. I'm sure they must have been telegrams or something. I was heavily involved at that time in an organization called the Association of Arab American University Graduates, and I was actually a president of that organization, one of the founders. And it took some time, and we got the discovery that we did, and it was turned out that some domestic Zionist organizations were also feeding information to the FBI, and we knew that that domestic Zionist organizations had a spying operation on activists on the Palestinian issue. All of which came out in 1993 when the FBI itself released a great deal of information concerning the work of the ADL to a newspaper in San Francisco. And it turned out that, yes, over 10,000 people had been spied on in some fashion, including a lot of organizations like the American Friends Service Committee, anti-apartheid activists, etc. So this was the situation we were dealing with. Now, the FBI has a long history of surveillance of political activism and very much predated 1967. They spied on Martin Luther King, but the FBI I think it's a mistake to say that it's the FBI, because this is policy by the government, and the FBI is undertaking this surveillance on behalf of the government, and the government makes those decisions about who to target and who not to target. So we fought this case. We won part of it and lost part of it, and my case was the first one to be able to disclose without that they had been subjected to NSA surveillance. It was written in the press at the time that there were about 1,600 Americans that had been targeted in that NSA. But I was able to get an admission in the court that had occurred.
I'm sort of struck by a lot of what you're saying, because especially the part about these sort of private right-wing organizations feeding information to the FBI. I spent half a decade as a journalist trying to get the FBI to release its files on the International Solidarity Movement, which is a pro-Palestinian organization that goes over and does nonviolent resistance in the occupied territories. When I finally got the files released after a very long time, one of the things that struck me was that in the predication justifying the investigation, one of the sources they cited the most were like outside right-wing groups, like people associated with David Horowitz, who's a very sort of notorious anti-Palestinian, Islamophobic, pro-war, demagogic right-wing figure who, during the Bush era, ran this magazine that did basically like McCarthyite-style blacklisting, and that was their big source. And, you know, some of the stuff they had in these publications contradicted stuff that was on the State Department website. So I'm really sort of struck by the extent to which the FBI has for decades relied on sort of fringe right-wing, or in your case, Zionist organizations. I know with the surveillance of the opponents of Reagan's El Salvador policy, it started with publications they'd read in the John Birch Society magazine. And in a recent case, the inciting source was InfoWars, the right-wing conspiracy website. So that's really just something that's always jumped out at me. And I would note that while I think many people may know about sort of private surveillance groups like, you know, historically the Pinkertons or more recently Tiger Swan, I think a lot of people would be shocked to learn that the Anti-Defamation League has engaged in this type of surveillance. And I was doing a research project that I don't think is going to come to fruition about sort of the history of surveillance of Palestine solidarity organized in the U.S. And I was going through the old newspaper articles in California from the 90s when the ADL spying first came out. And I was struck by this comment from their Pacific Southwest director where he said, this is explaining why people are angry at them. You know, I'm just guessing, but we know the anti-intelligence atmosphere is stronger in San Francisco than anywhere else. The leftists have been successful in closing down virtually all the intelligence operations of the police, and they'd like to put us out of the business too. This is the ADL Pacific Southwest director referring to the ADL as an intelligence operation, which is, I don't think how most people would think of them. What was the significance of the ADL's spying revelations?
Well, it's interesting, you know, because for years they had worked closely with the FBI on dealing with anti-black racists in the South. All right, they had had a close relationship. But when the civil rights movement started and they started sending lawyers down to the South to help people, they tried to counteract any leftist lawyers that went down there to help. And they created their own organization. I mean, I have had a friend who's now deceased. His name was Henry Schwarzschild, who worked for the ADL and he resigned from the ADL. He headed up that program to send lawyers down to the South. He quit the ADL because they had been spying on Martin Luther King, and he told me that personally. So they have this incredible reputation as being this anti-hate organization and this civil rights organization, etc. But a lot of people do not know about the dark history of the ADL, which has been so much oriented toward Israel promotion and protection.
And in the California case, they actually got a former San Francisco police intelligence officer to give the files to their private investigator after the San Francisco police were forced to disband the intelligence unit. And they gave over all of this political surveillance files to, including, I think, like driver's license information that violated California state law, to this private organization.
Right.
Your article from the early 90s in I guess it was Covert Action is quite illuminating. It's online, and I will make sure we put it up on our social media, because that's where I learned the bulk of this was from your work on it. And it's such a bizarre case from start to finish, including the fact that the police officer in a question in it claimed to have worked with the CIA, and at one point I believe fled to the Philippines to avoid extradition to the US. I really recommend people read up on this, because it's a strange case. One of the things that I was remiss in not asking you earlier when you were talking about your own lawsuit with the FBI, was the FBI surveillance against you part of or related to Operation Boulder?
Well, that term never came up.
Okay.
But Operation Boulder, I'm very familiar with, because I was heavily involved in taking affidavits from people and filing complaints, etc.
Could you tell the listeners what Operation Boulder was?
Yeah, Operation Boulder was a intergovernmental program involving 13 different government agencies: the Secret Service, the FBI, the Treasury Department, the Immigration Service, all of these. And it was someone in the State Department became the coordinator or head of this Operation Boulder. And it was an effort that was initiated after the massacre in Munich by the Nixon administration to create a database of activists on the Palestine issue in the United States. And they went to all the foreign student officers on college campuses to enlist them to get information. They began deportation proceedings against a number of activists. And it was at this time that I got to visit at my home, actually, in Detroit. And the whole purpose of this was to create this, like I said, this database. And an article appeared in the New York Times on the front page. I'll never forget this. And it said that the FBI had consulted with Jewish intelligence sources in the United States, all right, because they wanted to find out what they already had. And they were exchanging this information. And all of this was done to support the occupation and to support Israel's depredation of Palestinian rights.
One of the more shocking cases involving the FBI basically acting to enforce political orthodoxy in this country on the issue of Palestine is the case of the Los Angeles 8. And like I said, I was doing some research on a project that's probably not going to happen about the FBI surveillance of Palestinian solidarity activists. And I came across that you were involved in this as well. The only other person I think I more frequently stumble across who's been involved in various civil rights things I've been looking at is George Crockett. He seems like he was everywhere, and you seem
my God, he was.
You seem like you were
wonderful.
You seem like you were almost as many places as he was. You were the two people. Whenever I'm reading something, it always somehow either you or George Crockett seems to pop up. But
let me just say something about my own lawsuit.
Sure.
Sure. I wanted to tell you how it ended up.
Oh yes,
right?
Of course.
All right. After we went to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals reversed part of the summary judgment handed down by the district court, and we did not get a en banc hearing after that, and were not granted a writ of certiorari to the Supreme Court. At that time, I was not interested in any monetary damages. This was not my purpose in bringing the lawsuit. So we told the FBI that we were prepared to have this case settled if they would agree and stipulate that I had merely been exercising First Amendment rights, that I had not been engaged in any criminal activity, and that they would destroy the entire file. And they agreed to every one of those stipulated things, and that is now part of the record of the case. It took me more than 4 years after that stipulation to finalize their assertion of the file destruction. I'm confident that has occurred now. So that's how that ended. And here this so-called investigation that they placed on me began in 1967, immediately after the June 67 war, and lasted up through the time I brought this lawsuit in the 70s. As far as the LA8 case, I had closed my practice and I moved to Washington, D.C. to head up the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee at the time of the LA8 case. And of course, that case, the lawyers that handled that case, they deserve incredible plaudits because they just they worked on this case for 20 years. And they got 6 different court decisions dismissing the case, and the government would come back with something else. 6 different ones. And finally, the government gave up. So that was a long and arduous task. At first, they started out with the charge that they were in violation of the McCarran-Walter Act, which is that they were communists. All right. And then that McCarran-Walter Act provision of the immigration rules and regulations was thrown out. And then they came back that they were providing material assistance, raising money and selling magazines supporting a particular faction of the PLO. And that took a long period of time. But ultimately, they succeeded and won, and they're living here. But people should not have to have that kind of stamina and marshal that kind of resources just to protect basic constitutional rights. It's just not American. All right. If we say that we live by the rule of law, but make it so difficult for people to take advantage of those laws and get a decision in a reasonably fast fashion, then that's not providing for the rule of law.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating case because it gives you sort of a snapshot of the history of the U.S. security state, because as you mentioned, it's initially brought under the McCarran-Walter Act, which was passed in 1952 and is sort of this bête noire of civil libertarians in the McCarthy period. And when the case is finally ended with the last defendant or last accused person during the Bush years, I believe it's being brought under the Patriot Act. So you get like the gamut from like the McCarthy Cold War repression to the Bush War on Terror repression. And for people at home who aren't familiar with this case, it's a deportation case. And a few weeks after these 8 individuals who are arrested, 7 Palestinians, 1 Kenyan, who are, involved in activities supporting Palestinian rights and are spied on by an FBI agent for years. And the FBI agent cannot find anything criminal they've done. So he gets the then INS involved. And a few weeks after this, William Webster, the then FBI director, tells Congress, and I'm just always floored by this quote, and I'm going to read it verbatim. If these individuals had been United States citizens, there would have been no basis for their arrest. This is purely a case about First Amendment protected activity in support of Palestinian rights. And this one FBI agent spent 2 years surveilling them. He could find no crime. He was zealous in his obsession. And he then brought these deportation proceedings, which, as you mentioned, eventually result in a victory, but only after really great hardship for the defendants.
That's absolutely correct. And we have to understand that there was not a lot of pushback by a lot of liberals in the United States against this happening. And that is also something that people should take note of. And I think part of the reason is because this involves Israel. I really think that that's a major reason. And too many have been willing to allow Israel to operate in this country against people's rights. Right now, we're facing a situation in California where they forced Zoom and Facebook and one other social media operation to completely cut off any communications by a person from Palestine who was appearing in San Francisco at one of the universities there. They were completely denied any kind of exposure to the American people, and it was because of pressure from these groups.
Defending Rights and Dissent has condemned what Zoom has done, and we've signed a number of public statements and letters to Zoom. It's a complete attack on academic freedom, what they've done. And I would just say, if people want to learn more about the Los Angeles 8 case, there's an excellent book authored by David Cole and James Dempsey called Terrorism and the Constitution. And it's not just a great book, but Defending Rights and Dissent is the original publisher of it. It was later republished by the New Press. But it's a work that we played a part in having published, and it's still one of the most valuable resources on this subject. Unfortunately, the last edition was actually before the case was settled, so there's some additional information that could be in there. But it's a good look at the case. It's interesting how we keep coming back to the subject of Palestine, because when I was working on this report we did called "Still Spying on Dissent: The Enduring Legacy of FBI First Amendment Abuse," I was going back and compiling sort of a timeline of all of the known instances of FBI abuse, or at least the very notable ones. And one of the ones that was really shocking in the timeline, my coworker actually worked on it, she was at the Chicago Bill of Rights Defense Committee at the time, was that during the first Gulf War, or in the run-up to the first Gulf War, the FBI went around and visited Arab Americans at their homes, knocked on their doors, and asked them a lot of questions about their political views, mostly in relationship to that war. I know the ADC was very active in opposing this, as was the late Congressman John Conyers. And I was going through the New York Times article from the time, and the big question that people had was, how did they know where these people were and how to knock on their doors? People were afraid the FBI had a list of, Arab Americans in this country. But something that the ACLU representative, Kate Martin, who was at one point on our board at DRAD and I believe now is at Center for American Progress, tells the New York Times is that a lot of the questions are about Palestine. And she says, the FBI has long considered support of the PLO position in the Middle East to be equivalent of terrorist activities, and thinks that gives them the right to treat people who hold these views as terrorists. And just going through some of the other big abuses, Operation Vulgar Betrayal in the 90s, which we talked about on our opening episode with Mike German, the Holy Land 5 prosecution, a lot of these cases have a nexus to Palestine or Palestinian solidarity organizing. So I guess my question to you is, to what extent do you think decriminalization of support for the Palestinian cause has facilitated sort of broader surveillance of Muslim American or Arab American communities in this country?
Well, once they use the word terrorism, that takes it to a whole new level. And there's much more acceptance by the broader public for measures that they would not think much of regarding surveillance if they were not having this label of terrorist attached to it. So I think that we've gone through a long, long history in this case, and I don't know when it's going to end, because it is so tied up with the whole issue about Palestinian rights and Israeli repression of Palestinian rights, and America's siding with Israel in basically in this occupation and the colonization of the territories that were seized in 1967. So until that issue is resolved, I suspect we're going to continue to see these heavy-handed measures against people, Arabs and non-Arabs, that are supporting Palestinian rights. And we see it every week. We see one case after another in this part of the country or that part of the country, professors that are being denounced, people being put on blacklists. By the way, the ADL has, to the best of my knowledge, ceased its surveillance, but it has been offshored to some other organizations. You mentioned the David Project, and there are others that are still conducting and doing the same things. And I think that is because there's been a division of labor in terms of the surveillance now. But they still are working with the authorities. I just read an incredible love letter. That's what it was called. That's what he called it. It was by James Comey, to a group of the ADL that he spoke to. And he said, this is a love letter, and he signed it. He signed it, Love, James Comey. And that's exactly what the relationship they've had with the FBI, even despite the fact that the ADL was violating people's rights for years in this country.
You're absolutely correct. We've seen instances of FBI agents questioning students who are active for Palestinian rights, and they bring up stuff from this ridiculous blacklisting website called Canary Mission or similar sites. Right. So I guess my final question for you is what do you think is at the heart of FBI surveillance of Muslim American and Arab American communities?
Well, what I think is at the heart of it is the politics. It's the politics of it. That they, have been mobilized to support American policy, which has not been one that has been friendly to Arab American and Palestinian rights or Muslim rights. That's all it is. It's just a purely political situation where a state law enforcement agency has been utilized to support the politics. And until those politics change, this situation is going to continue.
Abdeen, it was an immense honor to have you join us today on this podcast. We really thank you for spending the time with us. That was Abdeen Jabara. He is a longtime civil rights attorney who has represented a number of people who have been victims of government abuse, including Arab Americans. He himself was spied on by the FBI and the NSA for his activities. We're on our home stretch at the Still Spying podcast. We have 2 episodes left, one covering the role of the FBI in the McCarthy era, and one covering the FBI's history of surveillance on our organization. After that, though, we'll be returning with a new podcast series exploring the plight of national security whistleblowers.